Hey guys, happy Friday. We are so exhausted from that marble activity, so here's your video. Lesson 1, Part 2.
All right, guys, so remember, when we look at Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, we've really got 3 regions that we're talking about, okay? We've got our larger Fertile Crescent region that stretches all the way from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and it's that arch-shaped area of land with the fertile soil that's good for growing crops. We learned a vocabulary word, silt, with this, all right? We also have our middle-sized area, Mesopotamia, which means our land between the rivers. And you can remember which one's bigger because Mesopotamia is in the middle, it's the middle-sized, and it starts with that M. And our smallest area is right here, Sumer or Sumer, and you're going to hear it pronounced different ways. And that's right down here at the Persian Gulf end of the Fertile Crescent. So our smallest region is Sumer, our middle-sized region is Mesopotamia, and our largest is our Fertile Crescent. Now, our first civilizations arose in Sumer. Today when we did the marble activity, I noticed that a lot of groups, when they had the opportunity to move their villages or their city-states, moved down towards the Persian Gulf because the flooding was less severe there, and they could control the floods a little bit better. Well, the ancient people of Mesopotamia figured this out too, and so we start to see some of the earliest cities down near the Persian Gulf in this region. These people are called Sumerians. So when we refer to the Sumerians, we're talking about those early Mesopotamians in Southwest Asia down near the Persian Gulf. And they're the ones who really built the first cities that we have archaeological evidence for in Mesopotamia. Now the problem was that even though they did have the Tigris and Euphrates on either side, we know that the geography of this region meant that during the summer it was very, very dry. And so they were surrounded by mud flats all the time that was not very easy to travel through. In addition, there were areas of just absolute desert that they couldn't get through either. Because of this, it made it very difficult to travel by land or to communicate with other groups. They were mostly cut off from their neighbors. They could trade and move around a little bit, but on a day-to-day basis, for the most part, they were very isolated. Think about this like here at school, okay? We are all belonging to the same school. All of these Sumerians belong to this region of Sumer. But depending on where you were and your daily schedule, you might not have much interaction with each other. So think about here, if you're in Mr. Green's room right here, it takes a while and it takes a good amount of effort to get down to Miss Gray's room right here. So even though you belong to the same school, you probably have different classroom rules. You might not know the kids in that class, and really you're very isolated from each other. We see this in our own school too. We're down here in our little 6th grade hallway, and for the most part, all of our classes are down here. Y'all don't go into the 8th grade or 7th grade hallway much, and you might not have much interaction with them. It'll happen sometimes, but really not a whole lot. Even within classes, we for the most part stay to ourselves. Now, down in my room, we love Miss Hodges. We do the same thing. We learn the same thing. We have some things that are very similar, but on a day-to-day basis, we really don't get to see her class much unless we make an effort to go do it. So we're very isolated. The city-states of ancient Sumeria were very similar to that. They shared some cultures and some religion and language, but they had different rules from city to city, and for the most part, were more isolated. Because of this, we see that these cities started to be very independent. And these cities started to gain control of the lands around them. And that was both politically, so whoever is in charge of the government, and economically. And that means money-based. So if you had a tiny little farm and you wanted to sell your goods, you're going to go to whatever city-state is closest to you to be able to trade and sell your goods. So by effect, you're kind of part of that city's influence, and they have a little bit of control over you. Miss Hodges is going to tell you a little bit more about the effect of this and how this kind of shaped culture.
2 minutes.
All right, guys, so we're going to talk a little bit about the city of and how Sumerian city-states developed. We're looking at city-states as being individual states, little cities that develop and have their own government and their own form of culture, their own city walls, and their own little self-contained, isolated government. And so all the cities would build walls around them. If you look at this one, it actually has 2 walls for protection. And they would have their inner circle where they would have all of the palaces would be, their ziggurat would be, and the people would live in there. And the second circle you can see is more for farming and more for irrigation. They actually dug a canal that went right through, and you can see the farming on the outside, and they had lots of room for irrigation. So the population from the city-states would range from 5,000 to 20,000 people, depending on how many folks lived there and depending on how organized the city was. Each city-state was surrounded by a wall made of mud, and that would help protect the city in times of flood. And you know from your marble activity, you've got to have some way to protect your city. Then the ruler and the large temple that would be located in the center of the city where it could be most well protected. And they would have the ziggurat there. That's where the priest would live. That's where the king would live. And he would be in the center of town. So everything circulated around the city of town. The center of town, sorry about that. And often city-states went to war over the resources, and you completely understand this because our resources were limited during our marble activity, and you guys were not happy when people got in your space, and you weren't happy when people had more resources than you. And so your options are you can either go to war over those political boundaries, or you can get it together and have times of peace and trade with one another and form some alliances. So I'd like for you to fill in the rest of your notes. You completely understand how a city-state works now, especially after our marble activity. And so city-states would often go to war over the resources, political borders, and sometimes even glory. But they could get their life together and share the resources that they had and make everybody more wealthy by having times of peace, trading, and forming alliances with each other. All right, guys, I will see you next week in class. Please remember to complete your homework and the hot question. I saw some empty hot questions today. You do not get full credit. That lets us know that you know what you're talking about on your hot question. So have a good weekend, and I will see you Monday. Bye.
Hi guys, Sumerian people worshipped many gods, known as polytheism. They believed the gods had power over parts of nature. Even though they honored all the gods, each city-state claimed one as its own. To honor this one god, they built a temple called a ziggurat. At the very top of the ziggurat, which is known as a holy temple, only special priests could enter. The Sumerian kings also claimed they received their power to rule from the city's god.
All right, guys, so in the last part of our notes, we are going to be talking about social groups or a social class. Now, remember, in our characteristics of a civilization, social structure is part of that. So, we're going to talk about what a social group or social classes looked like in Sumer. Now, before we actually get into the social hierarchy or that triangle that you may be used to seeing, we're going to talk about the gods. Now, remember, Miss Tickle discussed how important people viewed their gods and the kind of powers that the gods had. So, gods are not considered part of a social hierarchy. They are figures that are believed to be above everybody else. Okay, so that's why they're up in their cloud. Now, priests are actually on the top and in their own social class. It is believed that priests were given power by the gods, okay, and even special priests were allowed into the ziggurat. Okay, remember, Miss Tickle talked about that. So priests are considered to be their own social class. Now, the next class that we have is our upper class, which consists of scribes, which are people who write documents or copy documents. We have the nobility, which could be a king, and then we have rich merchants. Nobility or the upper class can also consist of people who fight. So warriors, anybody who fights for the city is considered upper class. Okay. And then our next class, which technically would be considered our middle class, consisted of merchants, farmers, and artisans. Now, This was the largest group of people. So that's still consistent with today. The middle class that we have in today's society is our largest class. And same with people of Sumer. The lower class slash basically the middle class was the largest group of people, and it mainly consisted of farmers. Then our lowest class. This is considered the lowest of the low, and it happened to be people that were slaves. Now, slaves were usually captured in war, so when people are trying to fight over land and those people lose, well, the winners will take on those people and actually use them as slaves. Okay, so captured from war, or they owed money, so they were in some sort of debt to the city. So they would be taken in and they would be taken as slaves until they could pay off their debt. Now, in order to be part of any of these social classes, you were usually born into them. It was very rare that you could move up the hierarchy, okay? So, usually born into the social classes. All right. Next up, you will see your hot question. So, today's hot question says, why do you think priests were so influential or important? Why did they have a lot of influence in the Sumerian society? Think about what Miss Tickle said, and think about what I said about the gods giving them power. Why were they so influential then? Go ahead and take a couple minutes to think about that, record your answer, and we can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Have a great weekend.